I want to take a few moments to kind of a man on the street segment of this message. I've got number 3 here. See if it's turned on and mute's off. Okay, there we go. I'm going to show some slides, and just for those of you who may want to volunteer quickly, just they're math problems. Now, if I were sitting out there, that would immediately eliminate me as a volunteer. So I'm just saying, some of you and others, like I'd really like to. These are now they're not tough problems. Jason, these aren't tough, are they? Yeah, okay. So now, if you need all the adults, if you need, I can go to just all the kids because they probably know the answers to these. If you're just having a little trouble, but I want to show a slide, and then I just want to come and maybe give some volunteers. You don't really win any prizes or anything, so there's nothing behind curtain 3. Just an opportunity for us just to brush up on a few basic math skills, okay? Jason, first slide. Don't say it out loud. Don't say the answer out loud, okay? I don't want to give it away, but I need a volunteer. Who would like to? Right here, these 2 young ladies. I'm gonna put the mic in between you. Both of you say it.
12.
Okay, say it loud.
12.
I'm going to let Jason be our, okay. Jason, you be the judge, because I might get it wrong. So I might have thought that was like 4 or something up there. So, all right, next slide. Who have I got? Let's go over. I see the adults are just bailing on me. I mean, they're not even going to touch this. Good grief.
64.
All right.
36.
There you go. Representing the adults. I hear you. All right. How about this next one? Oh, I saw it. Too late. You put your hand up. All right, Miss Pat.
6 minus 6 is 0.
Jason? All right, or Joe, there we go. All right, I'll go back to the other side.
Zero.
Got it? Right? Did everybody hear that? Jason, we have that right? 0? Robert? Somebody have another answer for it? Robert, are we right? He's our back. There we go. Next slide. Ooh. Carol, I saw your hand. She is really, really smart. I'm just telling you.
36.
Now, to stop on this last slide. Since when did 2 negatives make a positive? See, that's where I ran into trouble. That's why God called me to ministry and not math. So you mean, mathematically speaking, there are situations. We got a lot of engineer types in this fellowship, in this church. Mathematically speaking, there are situations where multiple negatives can actually result in a positive. Yes? How many of you know that what's true in math problems can be true in God's economy? God can actually take one or multiple, listen now, one or multiple negatives and bring about a great positive. Listen to this. Walking with God means sometimes seeing Him take great loss and create a great opportunity out of it. If you have your Bibles with you today, I want you to turn to the book of Genesis, chapter 47. Genesis chapter 47, and a message I'm titling, An Opportunity to Lose. An Opportunity to Lose. We are continuing verse by verse, section by section, precept by precept through the book of Genesis. The series is titled In the Beginning, although some of you are saying we're long past the beginning, Pastor Johnny. Now, I want to note something. I was preparing this week, kind of looking ahead, and it is possible. I will not commit to anything, but it is possible that we may round out Genesis by around June-ish. So we'll see how that all works out. But at this point, we are smack dab in the middle of the story of Joseph, which actually overlaps the end of the story of Jacob. And if you'll recall, Joseph, after having been sold into slavery, carted off to Egypt, made the head servant in the house of Potiphar, the director of the secret service for Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. Egypt was the most powerful nation in the world at that time. Joseph was wrongly accused, put in prison, and then became the most powerful prisoner in the prison. He was then asked by Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, to come and to interpret a dream, which he did. The dream, the meaning of which meant there would be a series of years of plenty and a series of years of famine. And after Joseph explained that to Pharaoh, Pharaoh put Joseph in charge of preparing for the years of famine, which basically included going around to different spots around Egypt and setting up storage points. He went all around Egypt and set up places of storage where in those 7 years of plenty, they could save up things. It's a great, by the way, we could learn a lot about budgeting from Joseph. When you have a lot more than you need, it doesn't necessarily mean you need to spend all the excess right then. Anyway, that's another probably point for another message. Still, Joseph went into that period, but as he went into the period of famine, the 7 years of plenty had passed, the years of famine began. His brothers, who had sold him into slavery decades earlier, showed back up to get food. He ultimately revealed himself to them. They went back to Canaan, where their father Jacob still, some 30 years or so later, thought his son Joseph was dead. They went back to Canaan, told their father Joseph was alive, picked up everything, because back in Canaan, where Joseph's brothers and his father still lived, it was famine. And Joseph was now the second most powerful man on earth. Joseph's brothers get their father, who is overwhelmed with joy, and they head back to Egypt. We looked over the initial reunion between Jacob and his son Joseph. And remember, Joseph was one of the only two sons of basically what was Jacob's most loved wife, if you will. Today we pick up in chapter 47. And we look at the scene where Joseph introduces his brothers and his father to Pharaoh. Genesis chapter 47, beginning in verse 1, and we read, "Then Joseph went and told Pharaoh and said, 'My father and my brothers, their flocks and their herds, and all that they possess have come from the land of Canaan, and indeed they are in the land of Goshen.' And he took 5 men from among his brothers and presented them to Pharaoh. Then Pharaoh said to his brothers, 'What is your occupation?' And they said to Pharaoh, 'Your servants are shepherds, both we and also our fathers.' And they said to Pharaoh, 'We have come to dwell in the land because your servants have no pasture for their flocks. For the famine is severe in the land of Canaan. Now therefore, please let your servants dwell in the land of Goshen.' Then Pharaoh spoke to Joseph, saying, 'Your father and your brothers have come to you. The land of Egypt is before you. Have your father and your brothers dwell in the best of the land. Let them dwell in the land of Goshen. And if you know any competent men among them, then make them chief herdsmen over my livestock.' Then Joseph brought in his father, Jacob, set him before Pharaoh. And Jacob blessed Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to Jacob, how old are you? And Jacob said to Pharaoh, the days of the years of my pilgrimage are 130 years. Few and evil have been the days of the years of my life. And they have not attained to the days of the years of the life of my fathers in the days of their pilgrimage. So Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out from before Pharaoh. And Joseph situated his father and his brothers and gave them a possession in the land of Egypt and the best of the land, in the land of Ramses, as Pharaoh had commanded. Then Joseph provided his father, his brothers, and all his father's household with bread according to the number in their families. Walking with God means sometimes seeing Him take great loss and create great opportunity out of it. For us, the great challenge is when we enter into adversity, trial, loss, difficult times, when we enter into those, the critical factor for believers, the critical factor for the children of God is that we might be able to maintain an awareness and a focus on the God who will make good out of it in spite of the fact that it's not good in it. Let me be very clear. God does not necessarily promise to remove the trial. He may do something far greater. He may do a work in your life, and on the back end of it, do something far greater than He ever could have done had you not had that trial. If anybody's life proves this out, it's Joseph. And so this morning, as we look through this passage, here's what I want you to consider, and here's what I want you to leave with today. I want you to leave with some ideas of some of the steps you might take in walking through adversity. I shared this morning in Sunday school, when I preach through a book like this, you know, there is a main theme to every book of the Bible. And when I preach through a book like this, especially when it takes me a couple of years to do it, there are those times where it feels like I've preached the same sermon 2 or 3 weeks in a row. And a lot of that is because we may hit a long stretch of chapters or passages that have a lot of the same theme. And I'll be honest with you, as we preach through these passages that deal with the life of Joseph, it seems that this theme keeps arising in the sermons. It almost feels like I've preached the same sermons several weeks at a time. And it's this idea, God working out that which is bad and making it good. There are various formats and approaches and thoughts and ideas, but all through the life of Joseph, we see a man who he could have laid down and quit. Right? Listen, I've known Christians who have stopped believing in God for far less than this, or who have threatened to stop believing in God, or who have questioned if God really cared for far less than what Joseph experienced. There may not be a life outside the life of Jesus Christ. In fact, Joseph, many have said, is a Christ type in the Bible. And there may not be a life outside of Joseph in the Bible that is a better proof of God taking that which can be devastating and making it victorious. This is a theme that keeps running. And listen, God's sovereign. Okay, so He knew when He led me to preach through the book of Genesis, He knew how long it would take me. He knew when we arrived at the passage of Joseph. He knew when all these messages that walk through the passages on Joseph would be happening. So if some of you are sitting in this service today and you're hearing this message and you're thinking, wow, that really applies to my life, make no mistake about it. God knew you'd be here before I ever started preaching through Genesis. He knew you'd be here today. That's not some kind of a sales job to sell this sermon. I absolutely believe that with my life. So might I suggest, even if you're not sure, even if you're really a little uncertain, even if you're in the midst of adversity, you say, you know what, I came because I wanted to make my mom happy. I came because I wanted to make my grandmother happy. I came because I wanted to make my spouse happy. Maybe that's the only reason you're here, but would you at least, since you're here, since you're spending this time here, would you at least be open to listening and hear what God has to say? Some steps in this walk that we're considering today, an opportunity to lose. Back in verse 1 that I just read, we see that Joseph shows back up. He goes to Pharaoh, and he explains to him, my father and his whole crew is here. And they've come down from Canaan. Now, Canaan is a word that's referring to the geographical area we know of as Israel today. At that time, it wasn't yet Israel. At that time, the Israelites had not technically taken possession of Canaan. A couple of Jacob's ancestors, several of his ancestors had been buried in Canaan. And at this point, Jacob and his family were living in that area of Canaan, but it wasn't officially Israel yet. It hadn't been officially taken possession of. So when you see the word Canaan here in the Old Testament, it's generally referring to that section of land we call Israel, although at this point it was not yet Israel. And so he tells Pharaoh they've come down from Canaan and they've come to an area known as Goshen. Miss Erlene, do you know where that is? You and Miss Evelyn spent time in Egypt, right? Goshen is in Egypt. It has a different name. It's not Goshen anymore, and I cannot think of the name. Later it would be referred to as the area of Ramses, which you could see that right here. There's the word Goshen I put on here. This is Canaan. Jerusalem, see that? The Dead Sea. They traveled down from Jerusalem, Jacob and his family, and they parked themselves right in here. One of the reasons they parked themselves right there, by the way, this is Mount Sinai, where Moses would get the Ten Commandments eventually some 400 years later. This is the area where the Israelites would have crossed the Red Sea. So it just kind of gives you a reference point. I got to tell you something, folks. There's nothing like a little lesson in biblical geography to just clarify in your mind what the Scriptures are saying. It's amazing. And so Jacob and his sons are right here. Joseph has gone on up into the capital of Egypt at that time to see Pharaoh and let him know that Jacob and his sons are hanging out here in Goshen. Goshen was a very fertile green pastures, a very fertile land. It was a land that would be great for Jacob and his herds. Interestingly enough, we actually learned back in chapter 46 that the Egyptians saw shepherds as an inferior race. See, they saw discrimination, racism, all of it, it's nothing new. It's been around since the beginning of time. The Egyptians looked down on shepherds for no other reason than that they were shepherds and hung out with sheep all day. And so here comes Jacob and his sons, and they're being introduced to Pharaoh. And back in chapter 46 of Genesis, Joseph actually explains to them what they need to say. And so here we come on verse 2. It says, and he, that is Joseph, took 5 men from among his brothers and presented them to Pharaoh. It doesn't say which 5. We'd have to guess probably the 5 oldest. We're not certain. But probably it wouldn't be a stretch to say that Joseph brought his 5 oldest brothers to introduce them to Pharaoh. You say, why not everybody? They had their flocks, they had their herds, they had their families. They couldn't just, all 12 of them just up and leave. Or all 11 of them in that case. Verse 3. Then Pharaoh said to his brothers, this Pharaoh speaking to Joseph's older brothers, what is your occupation? Now I want to pause for just a second. Their answer next is so intriguing to me. And I'm going to explain why, but to explain, I've got to show you something. Move back to chapter 46, verse 31. This is before Joseph has introduced his brothers to Pharaoh. Chapter 46, verse 31. Then Joseph said to his brothers and to his father's household, I will go up and tell Pharaoh and say to him, my brothers and those of my father's house who are in the land of Canaan have come to me. Got that? Joseph said, hey guys, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go talk to Pharaoh on your behalf. Verse 32. And he says, I'm going to tell Pharaoh the men are shepherds, for their occupation has been to feed livestock, and they have brought their flocks, their herds, and all that they have. Verse 33, so it shall be, and this is Joseph coaching his older brothers. Right? Now, that's not that unusual. When you're brought before some monarch or some royalty, and really any high political office, there is a certain protocol. But especially in royal courts, and especially Pharaoh, who was viewed as a god, there's a certain protocol you need to follow. Joseph, second most powerful man on earth, he knew the protocol. And in particular, he knew the protocol, what it would be for his brothers and their situation. So verse 33, so it shall be, when Pharaoh calls you and says, what is your occupation? Verse 34, that you shall say, your servant's occupation has been with livestock from our youth even till now, both we and also our fathers, that you may dwell in the land of Goshen. And Joseph says, you're going to do this because you want to live in Goshen. For every shepherd is an abomination to the Egyptians. Well, you say, Pastor Johnny, how did it help living in Goshen? Well, you saw on the map, Goshen is actually an area that's slightly separate from the main body of land of Egypt. So not only would Jacob and his sons and their flocks as shepherds kind of live separate from the Egyptians, but they would actually be in the overall geographical area known as Egypt. They would not only live in Goshen but as a means of kind of being separate, but they would still be able to stay all together as a family. They would be able to feed their flocks. And it's intriguing to me that Joseph had this much influence on Pharaoh. That men who in most cases Pharaoh would see as beneath him, he was fully prepared to grant them this land. Now, so what I just read to you in chapter 46, that is before meeting with Pharaoh. That is Joseph coaching his older brothers who decades earlier had tried to murder him and decided to sell him into slavery. It's very important because I want you to see something here. So verse 4, the brothers are answering Pharaoh, right? Verse 4 of chapter 47. Verse 4 of chapter 47. And they said to Pharaoh, we have come to dwell in the land. By the way, that word dwell literally means to sit. That's important because even in their language, it seems that the brothers understood they were there on a temporary basis. These brothers had somehow, some way, come to at least become aware and believe in the plan of God to put them in the promised land. Remember, God had promised them the nation of Israel. God had promised it to them. And so while they were coming down to Egypt to dwell or sit for a time, even the brothers, who decades earlier were some of the most wicked people you would ever come across. I mean, what kind of person does it take to want to murder their little brother, to want to throw their little brother in a well, to want to take their little brother and sell him off into slavery? I mean, what kind of person does it take to do that? But now, decades later, I would submit that these brothers have changed. By the way, could I suggest to you that nobody is too far gone? Verse 4, we have come to dwell in the land because your servants have no pasture for their flocks. They're answering Pharaoh. For the famine is severe in the land of Canaan. Now therefore, please let your servants dwell in the land of Goshen. The passage we read in chapter 46, remember when Joseph was coaching his brothers on what to say to Pharaoh? Remember that? If you compare what Joseph told the brothers in chapter 46 to what they actually said in chapter 47, would you say it's pretty much the same? I mean, there may be a couple of slight variations of wording, that kind of thing, but what Joseph told his brothers to say in chapter 46 is almost the same thing they said in chapter 47. Agreed? Yeah, I don't know who you're going to disagree with me, but anyway. We might be here a while if you want to disagree with me, but I'm just saying. Some 30 years or so earlier, when the brothers of Joseph were about to throw him in a well, kill him, and then sell him into slavery, how many people would have guessed that one day he was going to be their leader? How many people? Oh, I know we would now because we've read the story. That's easy. But at that time, how many people seeing that story would say, you know what? Here's what I expect. I expect that his brothers, even though they're trying to kill him and then they sell him into slavery, I think one day not only will he forgive them, not only will he bless them, I think he will be their leader. Fat chance is what most people would probably think. But here's the thing. If Joseph had not been sold into slavery, he would not have gone to Potiphar's house. If he had not gone to Potiphar's house, he wouldn't have been falsely accused. If he hadn't been falsely accused, he wouldn't have been put in prison. If he hadn't been put in prison, he would not have been introduced to the baker and the cupbearer. If he hadn't been introduced to the baker and the cupbearer, he would not have interpreted their dreams. If he had not interpreted their dreams, he would not have been introduced to Pharaoh as one who was an interpreter of dreams. And if he hadn't been introduced to Pharaoh as one who was the interpreter of dreams, he would not have interpreted Pharaoh's dream. And if he had not interpreted Pharaoh's dream, he would not have been put in the position to take care of the nation in the 7 years of plenty and the 7 years of famine. And if he hadn't been put in charge of the nation to be over the 7 years of plenty and the 7 years of famine, his brothers wouldn't have shown up, seen him, been reunited. If they hadn't shown up and seen him and been reunited, he wouldn't be in this place now to be their leader. So all in all, it was a good thing he was sold into slavery. Let me tell you one of the steps in this walk of losing, of adversity, of trial. It's this. In these kinds of situations, it sometimes provides a surprising opportunity to lead others. Circumstances that seem so bad to you right now. Circumstances that seem so difficult to you right now. Little do you know how it may give you an opportunity to lead people you never thought were possible. I don't know who that'll be. I don't know where that'll be. I can't tell you. I don't know how that'll be, but I'm telling you this. When we walk through adversity, God might be saying, look, there's no other way for me to get you to where I want you to go than to take you through this. In fact, I have a plan, and the only way it will work is to go through this. You say, Pastor Johnny, God's sovereign. He could have changed that for Joseph. He could have. But see, God's not only sovereign, but God loved Joseph very much. God wants the absolute best for Joseph, and He's not going to cut corners just to help him avoid trials. God loves you so much, He will not cut corners in your life just so you'll be able to avoid pain. Because it is in that pain that sometimes God does His greatest work in your life. And sometimes God is putting you in a position to one day be a leader of people or of ministries or of groups that may not otherwise have ever happened if it hadn't been for the trial. It's a surprising opportunity to lead others. You remember that when you're facing what you face. Look at verse 5. Then Pharaoh spoke to Joseph, saying, your fathers and your brothers have come to you. The land of Egypt is before you. These verses reinforce to us just how incredibly fond Pharaoh was of Joseph and how much trust. I hope you're seeing this. It is impossible for a man like Joseph, in the situation he was in when he was young and where he was born, it is impossible for him to be in the circumstance he's in right now and the position he's in right now, but yet it happened. It's impossible for a shepherd growing up in Canaan, the backside of the desert as far as Pharaoh is concerned, to grow up and become the second most powerful man in the world under Pharaoh. That's impossible. And yet it happened. Jesus said it this way. I paraphrase, God specializes in the impossible. I think God prefers the impossible, because then there's no way we can take credit for it. And that's better for us, by the way. And so here we are in verse 5. Now watch this. When we're walking through trial, sometimes it affords us a surprising opportunity to lead others when it's all said and done. I've seen situations where people walk through adversity and the experience they had gave them a connection that down the road allowed them to lead others who maybe had the same kind of trial in a way that they wouldn't have had the opportunity if they hadn't gone through the trial earlier in life. Just all kinds of options. And so these kinds of situations can afford us a surprising opportunity to lead others. But these kinds of situations, these trials, these difficulties, these adversities can also do something else. You ready? They can offer us a serious option of blessing others. Look at verse 5. Then Pharaoh spoke to Joseph, saying, Your father and your brothers have come to you. The land of Egypt is before you. Have your father and your brothers dwell in the land, in the best of the land. Let them dwell in the land of Goshen. And so he's given them a great place to live. Joseph, we got this subdivision down in Goshen. It's homes from the 300s, homes from the 400s. Why don't you let them go live down there? We got a bunch of houses that were built. In fact, we'll build whatever needs to be done, and they can live right down there. Tend their flocks, it's going to be great. By the way, Joseph, verse 6, and if you know any competent men among them, implying that maybe Pharaoh hadn't found incompetent shepherds. The problem is with looking down on people, or they look down on shepherds. The problem is they needed shepherds. And if you're a culture that looks down on a certain group of people, don't be surprised if you all of a sudden miss some critical needs in the culture because those people left because they don't like being looked down upon. Kids were born in Egypt. You think they aspired to be shepherds? Of course not. Didn't nobody want to be a shepherd? But what are you going to do when you got sheep? Well, I'll tell you what you do when you got sheep and don't have any shepherds. You have a young man be sold into slavery, go to Potiphar's house, be thrown in jail, go to Pharaoh's courts, and ultimately bring his family down so they can be your shepherds, right? And so here it is. He says, I want them to go down and live. And if you know any competent men among them, then make them chief herdsmen over my livestock. Here's the serious option of blessing others. First, there's a serious option of blessing others personally. That is, Joseph was now going to provide his brothers with great homes, great places to live, and good jobs. I mean, who wouldn't take that? Right? Look at verse 11. I'm going to go back and cover the other couple of verses, but let's skip forward for a moment. Verse 11. And Joseph situated his father and his brothers and gave them possession in the land of Egypt and the best of the land and the land of Ramses as Pharaoh had commanded. So what we see here is Joseph, decades later, he was blessing his brothers. I'm going to come down here because I've got a question. I just want to kind of be eyeball to eyeball, right? How many of you in Joseph's situation here still would not have forgiven your brothers, let alone blessed them? I dare say we may have some folks sitting in this fellowship today. I don't know. There are situations you've been through that are far less than this, that you were offended by, and you've carried some petty grudge for a long time. And you know what it's causing? God would love to use you to bless some people, but it's a roadblock because you can't even forgive, let alone bless. Let me tell you something, folks. God will take us through adversity sometimes so that we can get this opportunity to bless other people. The problem sometimes comes in, we go through adversity, and it's all about us. The more you are absorbed in yourself, the less you will be able to bless others. But listen, God wants to use what you may be dealing with, your trial, your adversity, this loss, if you will, and give you a serious option of blessing others. Personally, but here's the amazing thing about God. You know what it means to be efficient? Efficient? That which you have, you use kind of all of it, use it very effectively. If you have $100, then use all of it as effectively as possible. None of it's wasted, right? If back in the olden days, they would kill an animal, they'd use the bones for something, they'd use the meat for something, they'd use the skin for something, they'd use that whole thing, right? Very efficient. God is a very efficient God. For every situation we walk through, He will use it not only in ways we can see, I'll tell you something, He'll use it in ways we never thought of. He'll use it 10 times more than we ever thought possible. Why? Because He's so efficient. What do I mean? Look at verse 7. Then Joseph brought in his father, Jacob, and set him before Pharaoh. Jacob. Now, could we try to get in our Holy Spirit-filled imaginations, try to get a picture of the old, stooped-over shepherd Jacob? Been out in the sun for decades, leathery skin. Clothes smelled like sheep. I'm sure he cleaned up some to be before Pharaoh, but there's only so much you can clean up, right? Jacob wasn't ashamed of his job. He wasn't ashamed of his vocation. But think about this. He's showing up in the courts of Pharaoh, the greatest leader on the face of the earth, a god to many people. Stooped, probably shuffling up to Pharaoh. At this point in his life, he's old, he's worn out, and he's just traveled from Canaan. And it ain't on a 747 either, in first class. He's probably tired, dusty, and Pharaoh, powerful, sitting on his throne. His royal court surrounding him. Now let me ask you a question. If we had just walked up on that scene, who would we see as the powerful one and who would we see as the weak one? Let's be real honest, right? You know. If most people out in the culture came upon this scene, who's the weak one? Who's the strong one? Well, Pharaoh is the strong one, of course. Pharaoh's the most powerful one, of course. And yet, in verse 7, it says, what did Jacob do when he saw Pharaoh? Bow before him? Homage him? Worship him? What does it say Jacob did for Pharaoh? He blessed him. Now, there are situations where the Scriptures speak of us blessing God. That's an act of worship. But in this case, human to human, one blesses another, which implies the one doing the blessing has something the one receiving the blessing needs. Now, you tell me, if we came upon this scene out in the culture, what in the world could Jacob possibly have that Pharaoh would need? I'll ask you another question. In what reality in this scene is Jacob more powerful than Pharaoh? Let me tell you what it is in the reality of God. Pastor Johnny, what do you mean? David. David's a young man. He's a shepherd, backside of the fields. He's got all these powerful, strong, strapping brothers who are soldiers. David was seen as a little sissy boy. His brothers were powerful. They were looked upon and they were respected. And Samuel came to anoint the next king of Israel, and they went through every one of David's brothers. And finally, Samuel asked, "Do you have another brother?" And David's own father implied, "You don't want him." He's kind of a little frail guy. He's pretty, but I mean, I don't think he's going to be king. And Samuel said something. He said, let me tell you something. Man looks on the outside, but God looks on the heart. God's critical factor is right here. What's inward? And so only in the economy of God could Jacob be more powerful than Pharaoh. Only in the economy of God could Jacob have something to offer Pharaoh. You say, Pastor Johnny, I don't know who I could bless. I don't have anything to offer. You better start looking with spiritual eyes rather than physical eyes, because God might be saying, you got something somebody else needs. I don't care how poor you are. I don't care how ratty your clothes are. I don't care how badly you feel about yourself. You have something somebody else needs. So shape up, because I'm going to use you. So we'll have a serious option of blessing others, not only personally, but watch this, secondarily. Meaning, it wasn't Joseph blessing Pharaoh. It was now Joseph's father blessing Pharaoh. Joseph had blessed his brothers directly. And now those that Joseph had blessed were blessing Pharaoh. How many of you know there are times when you're blessing other people and you get to see it happen? And then sometimes you don't see the fact that they go out and they bless others. It's like a second level of your blessing. If that first level was your child, it's almost like they're a spiritual grandchild going out and blessing others. You cannot possibly know how many people will be impacted simply by you blessing one person. But if you don't allow God to use you in adversity in a way that when you finish through it, you might be able to bless others, you'll miss it. We fight God and we complain and we groan and we react just like the world, and God's saying, you don't get it. It's not that I'm making you go through this, it's that I want you to go through this. I don't know what your adversity is, but I've probably said this 20 times in this series through Joseph. You know, you may think your adversity is worse than another. You may think your adversity is just not as bad as another. Maybe you think, Pastor Johnny, what I'm dealing with is really not that big of a deal. Yeah, but it's your adversity. Whatever it is, it's your trial. And maybe another person has another trial that's worse than yours. Either way, it's your trial, whatever it is. I'm telling you, God can use it. Now look at this, verse 12. Verse 12. Then Joseph provided his father, his brothers, and all his father's household with bread, according to the number in their families. Jacob answers Pharaoh, by the way, and I don't mean to skip that verse. I just want to clarify. Pharaoh asks Jacob his age. And his answer is so intriguing. There's no way I can miss this. Jacob in verse 9. So I'm basically 130 years old. Abraham had lived to 175. Isaac had lived to 180. That was his father and his grandfather. And Jacob says, you know, my years are few and evil, and I haven't lived as long as my father and my grandfather. What does he mean, few and evil? Here's what he means. You go back through the life of Jacob, and it's a constant experience of conflict and confrontation. And most of it he brings on himself. Young people, listen. What you do right now, I'm telling you, has implication for your life now and possibly decades from now. Don't think that somehow that this idea of adolescence, carefree, no worries life, just run out and have my fun and maybe do things that are going to affect me and damage things. And hey, at 18, I get a reset button and get to start all over again. It doesn't work that way. There are things that teenagers do daily that when they're 30 and 40 and 50 years old are looking back and regretting. Or how about things they do when they're young and now they're 130 years old going, you know, my days have been difficult. I haven't lived as long as my other fathers. The implication, I haven't lived as long because I've dealt with more adversity and it's just worn me out faster. That's Jacob. But then back to verse 12. The last thought is that Joseph has the opportunity to provide for his father and his brothers and his father's household. I mean, all their kids, everything. Who would have thought? Who would have thought back at the Egyptian slave trading caravan decades earlier? Who would have thought that one day Joseph is going to be investing in his brothers? How many of you know that sometimes adversity is preparing us for a special occasion to invest in others? Some of you have experienced that, by the way. You know, you faced adversity, and 10 years, 20 years down the road, you know what happened? You walked through that adversity, and later on, God actually has used that adversity to help you minister to others and invest in them. I see it happen all the time. In fact, if you had not experienced the adversity you did, you would not be quite as experienced to be able to address the needs of people now. One real simple thought is I talked with a friend of mine some weeks ago, a guy I went to high school with. When we were in high school playing football together, he had one particular season, he had a terrible trouble with a pulled hamstring. In fact, I think it was a torn hamstring, which is a very, very painful, that hamstring right on the back of your thigh. And it took him months and months to recover. He worked through that thing, and basically he missed almost an entire season of football to that. You know what he's doing now? He owns a chain of physical therapy clinics up around Atlanta. I talked to his grandmother. She said, you know, he realized what he went through, and it made him really intrigued in the physical therapy process and all of it. And now the thing that was such a trial to him is now turned it into a vocation, ministering to others. Now, I don't know him well enough to know whether he's using it for the glory of God or not. He may very well be or not. I don't know, but I know this. It was his experience, his adversity, that now has led him to do what he's doing today. Your adversity might very well be leading you into an opportunity to invest in others. But if all you want to do is fight against it, fall apart, you might miss the opportunity. Walking with God means sometimes seeing Him take a great loss and create a great opportunity. Back again when I was in high school, I was really just then learning the benefits of weight training. And even back in my day in high school, things have come so far. There's been so much scientific discovery about weight training and the way it benefits all sports. And back in that day, I think many thought the only people who lifted weights were football players, not basketball, not baseball, not other sports. And today, a lot of that's changed. But one thing I learned back in high school as we were lifting, what was a concept called lifting to failure. Lifting to failure. And the idea was you want to continue to challenge your muscles. And so if you're lifting, maybe a bench press, maybe a curl, maybe a deadlift, whatever, take the weight, and if you're doing it now, maybe add some more weight. And with a friend or a spotter or someone with you, lift that weight until you fail. And that's not a bad thing. Lift that weight till you literally cannot lift it anymore. And when I was in high school, one of the things they taught me was that last rep or two, that last repetition or two of that weight, even if you need help from a spotter, that last repetition or two, that's where you're really building muscles when your muscles are failing. They're being so taxed, they're being so challenged that it forces you to work harder to lift it up, and that is growing your physical muscles. God will bring adversity in our lives, and on purpose. He may actually bring us to a point where we think we're failing, to spiritual failure. But it's not so that we will fail. It is so that we will turn our hearts completely toward God and trust in Him as He helps us lift this spiritual weight. And as that happens, let me tell you something. We are building spiritual muscles. I would suggest to you that for a lot of Christians, we've got a lot of anemic, weak, spiritually weak Christians because they do everything they can to avoid pain or adversity or difficulty. Anything I can do, run away from it, get away from it, take something from a bottle or a pill bottle or a syringe or whatever I can do just to not have to deal with the pain, rather than saying, okay, Lord, you're my spotter. I'm going to walk through this adversity. As I'm failing, I'm falling on you, and you're going to help me to build strength. Folks, this is an opportunity to lose. So often when God takes us through these situations that feel like loss, He's actually creating opportunities. And so I'm wondering, who's in that today? In just a moment, I'm going to pray, and then you're going to stand. You're going to have an opportunity to respond. And here's the way you can respond. One, you may be finally ready to give your life to Christ. The ultimate fail, if you will. That in self, I can't do this, Lord. I've got to surrender myself to you. And today's your day to say, Pastor Johnny, can you explain to me how to give my life to Christ, how to trust Him as my Savior? And maybe that's you today. You come down front. I'll let you talk with somebody, sit down with somebody, pray with them, talk with them. Not going to try to force you into anything. But at least just let them explain to you what it means to be saved. And at that point, you know what? You may walk away from here not having received it. I hope not. But we're not going to press anything. But wouldn't you at least come and find out? Or maybe you're here today and say, Pastor Johnny, not only am I facing adversity, I need people with me to help me, and you need a church home. Part of the dysfunction of being separate from a church as a Christian is you don't have the people around you God has sovereignly provided to help hold up your arms and to help you through adversity. And maybe this is the place for you to come. Or maybe God intends for you to be here to help others through adversity, right? And maybe it's your time to come and say, Pastor, I'm supposed to be part of this church. I want to find out how. And we'll explain to you the membership process. Maybe it's just that you want to come and pray, seek the Lord. Right now, just after I pray, we're going to stand, and I want to have you respond. Pray with me. Father, in Jesus' name, as I pray weekly, Lord, I'm praying again today and asking you to work in our hearts so that we would obey you. Lord, no resistance, no hesitation. Lord, no putting it off. But Lord, today, help us that we might obey you in Jesus' name. You stand. As the Lord speaks to your heart, you come.